For today's episode, I decided to circle back to Rwanda and explore its first president, Grégoire Kayibanda. I was pretty curious about this guy since, for the majority of its history, Rwanda was ruled under a monarch rather than under a president. This was true even under Belgian and German colonial rule. So, how did Kayibanda lead Rwanda into independence? More importantly, why did his rule lead to an era of Hutu domination over the Tutsi minority? Before Grégoire, Rwanda was under German and Belgian control, starting off as German East Africa. This included Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi, all governed as a single colonial unit. It was a German territory from 1894 until 1918, when it transferred into Belgian hands under the mandate system of the League of Nations. Basically, colonies were to be coached into independence by benevolent overlords, though this rarely happened in practice. Patterns of resource exploitation, failures of representation, and paternalism presented themselves in Belgian Rwanda just as it did in other colonial African states leading up to decolonization. So, what was Rwanda under Belgian control? It was Rwanda Urundi, of course, smashing together two territories as a single unit. They share Hutu and Tutsi ethnic groups, and they're both landlocked and border the Belgian Congo. However, they would go down two very different paths, with Rwanda becoming a republic after independence, while Burundi became a constitutional monarchy. And about that ethnic makeup, I should do a quick refresher because it explains the positioning of Kayibanda prior to his election. There are three major ethnic groups in Rwanda and Burundi: the Tutsi, Hutu, and Twa. The Tutsi were generally shaped by their access to wealth, power, and governmental status within the pre-colonial monarchy. They were given further systemic privileges under German and Belgian domination. Hutu identity, on the other hand, was shaped by subordination to Tutsi rulers. Tutsis were generally cattle herders and made up the power brokers of complex systems of lending and gift-giving economies, while Hutus, the majority population, were farming the land. The word Tutsi and Hutu became common after the founding of the Nginya Kingdom in the mid-17th century. Monarchical Rwanda was divided into three main organizational structures, or corporations. The first is the Corporation of Menials. These are generally made up of poor Tutsis and Hutu peasantry who tended to the land and provided later to regional lords and power brokers. Next is the Corporation of the Official Herds. This corporation was mainly involved in the historic Tutsi industry of cattle herding and management. Lastly was the Corporation of the Military. The Rwandan kingdom was a heavily militarized state at the time, expanding far into the north. Because the Rwandan state was so militant, its borders and influence would expand. Thus, the power and influence of the ruling Tutsi elite would expand along with their culture and socioeconomic roles. Hutu and Tutsi as concepts spread to include foreigners in the north, and divisions between Hutu and Tutsi became institutionalized. Fun fact, these northern foreigners would become the ancestors of the future president Habyarimana, who would kill the first president, Kayibanda. Um, because of this socio-economic inequality, a lot of resentment was engendered within the Hutu population of Rwanda. This was only exacerbated with colonial rule. Belgian officials would empower Tutsi leaders to extract tribute and act as emissaries on their behalf, while Belgian Catholics would stoke Hutu resentments from churches. This served the function of dividing the Rwandan nation, making their dominion easier to manage. Grégoire Kayibanda was born into this social milieu. On May 1st, 1924, Kayibanda was born in Tare, Rwanda, to a Musi father from the Belgian Congo and a Hutu mother. He would later attend a seminary in Nyakibanda. After attending the seminary, Kayibanda would become a primary school teacher in Kigali at the Institut Classe. Kigali became a hotbed for organizing and nationalism among both Hutu and Tutsi activists. From there, Kayibanda joined multiple cultural associations like Rwandan Amités Belgo-Congolaises. He also wrote articles for the La Ami, a periodical based in Kigali. Later, in 1953, Kayibanda would leave his teaching job to become a secretary for the Education Inspection Division in Kabgayi. He was gaining further and further social capital among the Rwandan citizenry, and positioned himself as a Hutu man with power, or a still growing counter-elite. Okay, so take note. If you want to lead an independence movement, be a social butterfly. Kayibanda was a newspaper writer, leader in church organizations, and a representative for social cooperatives. These positions would allow him to become a secretary of the Rwandan Literary Society, and he would eventually travel all the way to Brussels to work at a missionary press center. As he rose, tensions grew in his native country. Rwanda was on the brink of revolution. Kayibanda's organizing work would eventually move from theological and literary societies to the more openly political. His political beliefs were mainly informed by his Hutu upbringing. He believed that emancipation for the Rwandan people had to have a specifically racial character, and that Hutus needed to be freed from Tutsi domination. He wanted to embody a leader that was popular and in touch with the masses, and the masses in Rwanda were predominantly Hutus. Thus dropped the Bahutu Manifesto, a document published by Kayibanda and 8 Confederates in response to a Tutsi organized document drafted for the United Nations. The Bahutu Manifesto asserted that the Hutu-Tutsi problem was a socio-political problem and that trusteeship only codified it. It further outlined that justice was only possible through the emancipation of the Hutu majority from the Tutsi minority. However, within this framework were beliefs that would perpetuate systems of inequality into the Republican era. The manifesto supported ID cards used during the colonial period, which were used to identify citizens by race. But why would Hutu politicians want to keep these racial ID cards? At the time, there was a widespread fear that Tutsis would try to obfuscate their power in order to continue ruling from the shadows, and that ID cards would show their affiliation. This fear was widespread. They believed that the Tutsi minority, which was about 15% of the population at the time, would hijack Rwandan democracy. This paranoia was pushed forward alongside the public anger towards wealth inequality, a lack of educational opportunities, constricted entrepreneurship, and a lack of government jobs for Hutus. This anger led to the future quota system that would define the independent Hutu-dominated Rwandan Republic. Kayibanda would return home from Belgium in 1959 to further organize the Hutu movement. He reorganized the MSM into the Parti du Mouvement d'Emancipation Hutu, or the more infamously known Parme Hutu. A month later, a Hutu chief was assaulted by a Tutsi mob, triggering a massive wave of revenge violence against the Tutsi. From there, Parme Hutu and Tutsi organizations began to clash. In response to the establishment of Parmehutu, Tutsi political organizations would attempt to establish themselves as well. One such party was the UNAR Party. Created in 1959, UNAR wanted an independent country based on the Tutsi monarchy, sort of like a constitutional monarchy in Europe. This was intolerable to the Hutu nationalists, who had already consolidated themselves for the independence push. In the 1960s, Belgium was prepping to relinquish control over the country to the Rwandan people. Because Parmehutu had mass appeal, it took the majority share of votes. Waves of intercommunal, retributive violence also served to bolster its popularity, as anti-Tutsi sentiment was ascendant. Kayibanda, as major organizer and leader of the Parmehutu movement, became poised to seize power for the historically marginalized Hutu, as well as to seize power for himself. And with the first election, the historic Tutsi monarchy was dissolved, and a brief transitional administration was established. Rwanda officially became independent at midnight of July 1st, 1962. With the independence of Rwanda came Kayibanda's ambition to set the country on the right track, that being to appeal to the former overlords who he had campaigned against. In a speech thanking Belgian and German colonizers, he stated, "Though the Belgians made some mistakes here, the net result of their effort has been most positive." He was laying on the honey in order to garner technical aid from the West. Around him, African countries were gaining independence without any industrial development nor expertise. The decision made sense, though it was grifty. Later that year, Kayibanda would be elected full president of Rwanda. The presidency of Kayibanda was not a very good one. It was a relatively repressive state held together by racial tensions stoked by the Parmehutu party. Its legitimacy was built nearly entirely on maintaining the newfound ethnic hegemony of the once oppressed Hutu population. The one-party republic largely regressed economically and relied heavily on foreign aid from former colonizers and Western powers like Belgium, France, and Germany. Rwanda descended into an ethno-supremacist project, with Kayibanda proclaiming Rwanda a Hutu nation. Ethnic violence began to spill over into neighboring Burundi and Congo, and an ethnic quota system based on the Belgian ID cards was established. Discrimination was institutionalized against Tutsis in this new state. Tutsis were shut out of government jobs and were only provided them as a percentage of the population. Basically, only 15% of jobs were reserved for Tutsis. At the same time, Tutsis would be fired if the quotas were exceeded, leading to insecurity and an environment of partiality. This quota system even extended into the church. Clerical appointments to the various Catholic Church positions were reserved primarily for Hutus, and the church itself supported these policies. This would have terrible consequences when the Rwandan genocide occurred, and numerous Hutu church officials were implicated in the atrocities. Church, state, and business were bent towards an ethnic and racialized end, and private industries were encouraged to discriminate against the Tutsis that would apply. The discrimination and ethnic violence led to thousands of Tutsis migrating out of Rwanda into neighboring Uganda, Congo, and Burundi. This laid the seeds for the RPF, M23, and the First and Second Congo Wars, which would rack East Africa. By 1965, Parmehutu was the only legal party, and Kayibanda was the only guy to appear on the ballots during that year's elections. This repeated itself in 1969, with Kayibanda being the only person on the ballot. The Parmehutu controlled state was also placed in the middle of a busy neighborhood for Cold War geopolitics. As Kayibanda secured his power, the continent was undergoing decolonial stresses in the empowerment of Pan Africanists, African socialists, and communist leaders across the region. These groups were generally aligned with the Soviets or the Chinese communists, and they opposed the meddling of their former colonizers in their continent. Kayibanda, on the other hand, decided to take the opposite tactic. He had communist activities outlawed in the 1962 Constitution of Rwanda and kept a patron-client relationship with former European powers and Western hegemons. He fell in line with the independence era stipulation that an independent Rwanda could only be realized with the rejection of communism. This had knock-on effects for the region, making Rwanda a reliable anti-communist bulwark in East Africa. It also inspired the UNAR, now a Tutsi opposition party, to threaten to become communist as a response. This pro-Western pattern generally continued with Kayibanda's acceptance of the Republic of China, Taiwan, over the People's Republic of China. Rwanda was also neutral on the Israeli-Arab conflict as well as the American invasion of Vietnam, both polarizing incidents in their own time. Kayibanda would hold on to power for a very long time, mainly coasting on the fears of the Hutus that Tutsis would regain power and take revenge. In 1973, the presidential term was extended and the age limit of 60 was lifted. This power creep began to stress the traditional relationships that kept the Hutu-dominant state afloat. Hutus from the north of the country were disempowered by Kayibanda's loyalists in central Rwanda. He was accused of concentrating power in his native prefecture of Gitarama. The result of this power consolidation went about as well as you'd expect. By 1970, the state was stifled and inwardly focused. The Rwandan state was reliant mostly on foreign aid, and endemic poverty was rampant. In order to distract from the dire predicament of the average Rwandan, Kayibanda's regime encouraged ethnic violence. Pogroms were a way to solidify his power and legitimate himself. The pogroms would peak in 1970. That year, there was an extremely large ethnic cleansing campaign brought about by Hutu peasants. This violence, at first encouraged by the state, would spill out into the murder of leading Hutu power brokers. The government was becoming increasingly dysfunctional, creating the perfect environment for the ambitious Juvenal Habyarimana to take power. Juvenal was a Hutu man who represented the increasingly marginalized factions of the north. As Major General and Defense Minister, he wielded quite a bit of influence, which he used to organize a coup. The coup against Kayibanda has been described as bloodless, but there were still 55 deaths in his cabinet. The families of these victims would be given hush money by the new Habyarimana regime. Kayibanda would face a similarly ignoble end. Him and his wife were kidnapped and held at a secret location before being allegedly starved to death. Okay, so concluding this biography, Grégoire Kayibanda was many things. A talented organizer, sure. Political entrepreneur? Definitely. He was also an opportunist. Whether or not he believed in the Hutu power rhetoric is hard to say, but the results of his policies are evident. Ethnic conflicts were entrenched within the new republic, becoming the base on which Hutu power would rest. He relied on aid money from foreign colonizers and left his country in a financially precarious position. Lastly, through his discrimination, pogroms, quotas, and ID cards, Kayibanda laid the groundwork for the calamity that would befall Rwanda in 1994. Ultimately, he turned out not to be a very good man.